Welcome back to another video, guys. Today I finally got the wire in, and I'm going to be tackling a lot of the lengthening and figuring out what wires I need for what terminals, and I'm going to be walking through with you guys kind of how I'm tackling it and going through the diagram and the support page online. So hopefully we can get through this, but I've got new wire. It's a cross-linked wire, GXL, so it's got a higher temperature rating and can withstand a little bit more stuff. 20 gauge, 18 gauge, and 12 gauge for different things. So 20 gauge is going to be used for a lot of the ECU pin connectors, 18 gauge for some of our higher amp stuff, which is like our 12 volt switch supply possibly, and maybe a couple other things. And then the 12 gauge, which is a lot thicker, is going to be used for like coming from the battery positive, and like there's 3 different battery positives to the fuel pump and maybe to the ignition coils. So I've got a couple things written down and figuring out what wires are going to go where. But here on the engine, I've got all the wires laid out: coolant temperature, distributor, injectors, throttle position sensor. We got a idle valve down here and knock sensor. And on this engine, it has like a different intake throttle body on the lower end, which is TVIS. So it kind of adds different air input at different loads and stuff like that, and that was what came with this engine. So we got to wire that up, and then our igniter and the coil. So lots of things to measure out, but there are things on the computer that have no connection, so I'll be saving a little bit of wire there. And on Haltech support page, they go through my engine and kind of work my way through like igniter, coil. I'm not doing coil unplug, so I don't need to worry about that. The throttle position sensor and all the wires corresponding to that and where they go. So I kind of have to follow that and figure things out. But we are going to get into it and starting cutting wires and going through this. Okay, so the first thing we've got are injectors. So we're going to have all 4 injectors have a wire coming from terminal A on the ECU going to the injectors, and then we're going to have power coming from the fuse box, and it'll go through a relay and stuff like that, and then go to our injectors. So I'm going to be using 18 gauge and measuring out lengths from connector A to injector, and then we'll do some other measurements and go from fuse box to injectors. Let's get started. And before I get too far into it, I already went to the car and measured out from where I'm going to have the ECU, and this kind of gives me a rough estimate of how long the wire should be. So not as long as those, but a little bit shorter. So good starting point to kind of figure things out and go from there. So first wire to injector number, I don't know which one, but I have it length out. So I'll pretty much set this to the side because I don't have new crimp ends for the injector terminal kits, but I do have the crimp ends for the connector A piece. So I'm going to kind of wait on that. 4 wires cut to length for our injector outputs coming from terminal A. Off to the next thing is ignition. Going to ignition, so that's going to be our igniter. We only have one connection going to ignition output number 1 in our connection A, so we got to go to our igniter, go look for our white cable where it's going to be, and measure that out to our length. Ignition wire cut, measured the length, good there. So a couple of things. Our 5 volt sensor supply has A9 is where it comes from, but it'll go to we'll have a map sensor, we'll have throttle position sensor, and a couple other things, probably using that 5-volt sensor supply. So what I'll do is I'm going to wait for that until the end. So once I have everything connected into the terminals, I'll go from terminal to the last thing that it'll need, which I think it's going to be our throttle position sensor, which is right here. And then cut that out, and then we'll splice it into all the things that it needs so everything can get power. In the meantime, we're going to start off with our throttle position sensor from A14, and that's the control unit from the ECU. And then we have a map sensor that we're going to run from A15, and I think a couple other sensors coming from air temperature and coolant. So we have coolant, air from B4, B3, which will run out, and then signal ground I'll do at the end too, because I'll have a main signal ground going out from connector B, and then I'll splice in all the wires that need a signal ground. Okay, more wires cut to length. I'm using painter's tape because the label maker was just taking a little bit too long. So we got a whole bunch of those done. Next thing, our distributor wires, which are going to be going to our crank input or the trigger input, and then CAN input or the home input as they're called in the Haltech software. So since we run a distributor, things are a little bit different versus your coil on plug and other things like that. I wouldn't be using the distributor, so we're going to have one wire going to trigger plus, one wire going to home plus, and then a signal ground, and then another one with no connection. So pretty much how that works is there's two things spinning in here that read the main position of the engine and then the position of the cam. And from that, we can mess around with the software in our ECU to tell it these are what we're looking at for the trigger activation, home activation, and some other things, so the ECU can fire accordingly to the distributor system on the engine. A little bit confusing, but I'm just going to wire it up and then see if I can figure it out from there. So hopefully that works, but I talked to Haltech for a little bit. They have another option which I could try later on if this doesn't work, but for now the two wires going to home plus, trigger plus, and then our signal ground. So let's do that real quick. Okay, so another interesting thing, we have an idle control valve on our intake throttle body, which is like down here, and on our Haltech ECU we're going to have a 12-volt switch power and then two spare outputs. So those spare outputs are going to be DPO, which digital pulsed outputs will work. I called Haltech and they said use two of those to control your idle control, and that's pretty much what I'm going to do. So connector A, 23 and maybe 1, or 18, I'll see which one. And the other thing, our tachometer could be read by one of these spare DPO outputs, but in learning with Haltech, our igniter has a tachometer output going straight from this to our tach, and I think I'll do that towards the end of the wiring because I don't know how long that's going to be. Okay, another thing that came in is our wideband controller. So with the Haltech Elite series, to run a wideband O2 sensor, you have to have a controller kit. I almost got mistaken on this, so I had to make sure I grabbed that. But this will go to our downpipe, and this is long enough where I might be able to run this into the cab. And then this wideband controller has another terminal connection where we'll plug that in, and then we'll have two inputs going to our CAN low, CAN high, or it's probably going to go to the main CAN connector piece on the front of the ECU, which is over there. I'll show that later. And then we'll have to have a 13.8 volt supply from the relay, and then our signal ground. Okay, so I think I've got everything done for now regarding going from engine sensors all the way back to our connectors. So now we're going to work on fuse box stuff. So I think they're going to be around the same position as the ECU. So we'll do same length from my little length measuring device there, from fuse box to the things on the engine. So that's going to be ignition coil, injectors, and a couple 13.8 volt supplies to some sensors. And then we'll start working on measuring out from ECU connectors to fuse box, which is going to be like a really short wire, but I'm going to be using different gauge wires for these things. We are making good progress, and I'm just going to keep working away. It's kind of just tedious work, crimping stuff and stuff like that. So, yep, I'll be back.